everyday energy. Nature would never have been so stupid as to make us dependent on sugar for a primary source of fuel. Something so unreliable. You know, I mean, you know, think about it. You know, what do your average nutritionists say? Never skip breakfast, eat every 2 hours, you know, you got to snack throughout the day, keep your blood sugar. I mean, if you're dependent on sugar as your primary source of fuel, that's what you got to do. And this is what most people are stuck doing. And you can manage your blood sugar that way, but I can't imagine how we would have survived as a species to this point if that's how we had to get through it. What about periods of famine? How the heck did we ever get through those? You know, some people can't even get till noon without a snack, without going half crazy. And, you know, sugar is this incredibly volatile and damaging and, again, unreliable source of fuel. It's constantly going up and down. And if we're dependent on that as our primary source of fuel, I'm telling you, we're in trouble. But within the context of that model, yes, you can do things to manage your blood sugar. That is a legitimate approach. There are things you can do. Eat that breakfast, you know, you snack throughout the day and whatever. I've got better things to do with my time than think about food constantly. There are better things in life. So a diet excessively high in carbohydrates is going to cause the body and brain to adapt to the unnatural dependence on blood glucose for its primary fuel, and all to our considerable detriment. And again, as creatures of the Ice Age, we are best designed to use ketones, not glucose, as our primary source of fuel. Ketones, of course, are the energy units of fat. We also use free fatty acids to some degree as well. And yes, this means the brain too. And in this textbook of basic neurochemistry, it states very clearly, in quotes, the brain uses ketones in a state of ketosis. When we are producing, not ketoacidosis, we're not talking about this life-threatening type 1 diabetic thing. And actually, type 1 diabetics do great on what I'm talking about too. But this rare condition, ketoacidosis, has nothing to do with ketosis. They're very different, and they get mixed up all the time. People freak out, and they're like, well, ketones, those are toxic, and those are dangerous. And no, they're not. Anybody who wants to burn fat has got to be in a ketonic state. You know, it's not a bad state to be in. So if carbohydrate cravings are so bad, why do we have them? Well, again, we're all metabolically adapted to being one of two things. We're either a fat burner or a sugar burner. So a diet that's dominated by carbohydrates is going to generate an adaptation to being dependent on glucose as your primary source of fuel. And it's really fundamentally an unnatural state. But it's one that our body, you know, will try to make do with what it has. And if sugar is what you're pumping in all the time, your body's going to be burning that like crazy to try to deal with it. It's just going to adopt that as its primary expectation. So a person's going to crave carbohydrates if you're adapted to being dependent on glucose as your primary source of fuel. Doesn't that make sense? I mean, if that's your primary source of energy, you're going to be preoccupied with that, and it's going to look really good to you, and you're going to crave it because you need it under that circumstance. So if we look at fat and sugar, it just totally take away the whatever issues with respect to nutrients and whatever else. But if we just look at fat and sugar strictly from the standpoint of the energy that they provide. So sugars, basically, they burn anaerobically most efficiently. They serve essentially as a turbocharged form of rocket fuel for emergencies and profound exertion. They also feed our red blood cells. They may be viewed analogously as kindling for our metabolic fires. So they burn very hot and very quickly. And the body is unable to store more than about 2,000 kilocalories of glucose, really, as glycogen in the muscles and liver at any given time. You know, you can use that up pretty quickly. So we're not very efficient at storing it, which should also be a clue. If we were meant to burn sugar as our primary source of fuel, we'd be able to store a whole lot more of it. If we needed it that badly, you know, we'd have storage places all over the place for glucose, but we don't. What do we store most efficiently? We store fat. And glucose needs constant replenishment, which I've got to tell you, you know, the food industry is only too happy to have us thinking that way. So, whole grains, brown rice, and all these kinds of things you can look upon, you know, again, if you're looking at the kindling model, You can look upon the sort of whole grain, the complex carbs that they call them, as being sort of twigs on the metabolic fire. Potatoes, bread, cereal, white rice, sugary snacks, all these things can sort of be looked upon as throwing paper on the fire. Burn a little hotter, a little faster. And alcohol. It's like putting lighter fluid or gasoline on the fire. And you know, with alcoholism, one of the reasons that they say once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic, is because you can stop drinking alcohol, but you haven't dealt with the underlying issue. Alcoholics are the most blood sugar dysregulated people walking loose on the planet. These people, the primary issue isn't alcohol. They're running and grabbing alcohol because that's the fastest way to get the fire burning again for them. It's like, you know, the fire's going out constantly, so they're wanting to put lighter fluid on that fire. But they haven't really dealt with the underlying carbohydrate addiction. And you go to AA meetings, and what do you see? Are people standing around smoking cigarettes, eating donuts, and drinking coffee, right? So they've given up one addiction for another. And until they recognize and they deal with the underlying issue of that carbohydrate addiction, what they say is going to be true for them. Once an alcoholic goes, they're always going to crave it, and it's going to be that one day at a time crap. And I know people who have been able to get away not just from drinking alcohol, but from even wanting it or thinking about it or even thinking about sugar or starch, just simply by adapting to a ketone-based metabolism. And it's not that hard to do. But, you know, you've got to make the decision and do it. So, I have a wood stove at home that looks something like this. Of course, mine has little shelves on it. It's very pretty. And I love this analogy because really, when you look at the whole carb-fat thing, you know, what you're really looking at is fundamental sources of the way we fuel ourselves. And I don't know how many of you have actually heated your home with a wood stove or understand something about that, but I'm from Minnesota, so you know. You know, you can run your wood stove, you can heat your house, burning nothing but kindling. And to do that, you're going to need a lot of storage space, for one, for this big volume of stuff. And you're going to have this little bench here kind of pulled up to the fire. And you're going to be pretty much sitting there all day long, throwing twigs and paper on the fire, and then God forbid you should take a bathroom break, because the fire is going to be going out, and you're going to come back, and oh my God, you're going to reach for the lighter fluid or the gasoline, and oh, the fire's going out, and you got to get that back up again, and then you will basically be a slave, spending your life defeating that fire with twigs and paper, and a little lighter fluid on the side at happy hour. So, the result? Again, there's a preoccupation with carbohydrates. And if you're insulin resistant, you're going to be sleepy after meals. If you're hypoglycemic, you're going to be cranky, irritable, and brain foggy before meals. You know, when you eat a meal, you shouldn't feel any different before or after you eat a meal. You know, when you eat your lunch or eat your dinner, you should feel satisfied. You should feel not hungry anymore, but you shouldn't feel like, oh my God, you know, I'm going to kill somebody if I don't eat something here pretty soon. And once you've eaten the meal, you shouldn't feel like, oh, I could sure use a nap. You know you have a problem if you have either of those two things for sure. But anyway, yeah, sweet beer, yeah. So, anyway. There's an alternative, however, to running your life, spending your life burning kindling, and that is dietary fat. Dietary fat burns aerobically. In other words, you're walking around breathing oxygen, having conversations, doing your everyday thing. You're aerobic, essentially, and fat is ideal for that. It burns in a much more prolonged and sustained manner. Fat can be looked upon sort of metaphorically, instead of kindling, as sort of instead putting a log on that metabolic fire. And fat, of course, is stored much more efficiently and drawn upon as energy from reserves for a much longer period of time. It's very even burning. You have fat as your primary source of fuel. You have this nice little hum going right down the middle of this, and this range will probably get lower in time because you won't need the blood sugar anymore for energy anyway. So again, it needs much less frequent replenishment. I mean, I can have a duck egg cooked in butter at 7 o'clock in the morning, and if I haven't had, you know, anything to eat until like 1 or 2 in the afternoon, I might be hungry. But I'm not going to be cranky and irritable and brain foggy and fatigued and ready to kill the next person that says anything to me, or, you know, or anything, or, you know, craving that Starbucks or whatever. It's going to be like, well, you know, I'd really like to eat something. A handful of nuts might take care of it, you know, until I get something else. But I can go for very long periods of time on not very much food, because fat, again, is it just lasts a very long time. I'm not thinking about food constantly. That's the big difference. So here's our fireplace again. And now you can put the bench back, and you just throw a nice log or two on the fire. And guess what? Now you've got a life. You can go out and you can do things and go places, and you know, and you can function. You can, you know, your brain can do what it needs to do, and you know, you'll want to eat from time to time because you're hungry, but just because you're hungry, not because, you know, your blood sugar's a mess. And you know, we have a choice. You can either manage your blood sugar, and be dependent on it, or you can get the blood sugar out of the mood and cognitive equation altogether and learn to rely on fat as your primary source of fuel. And you do that, of course, by removing sugar and starch as an alternative, so that your body says, well, we don't have that, I guess we have to rely on this. And it works. But for some people, that transition can be a little easier than for others. There are some other causes, reasons that people crave carbohydrates, aside from what we just talked about. Some people have a Candida yeast overgrowth, or they have parasites. Sometimes the cravings aren't even yours. You know, you got somebody else in there, you know, hello, you know, we'd like some food down here. And, you know, you're being compelled by forces seemingly beyond your control. You can't understand why you have these constant cravings. So, you know, you need to take a look at that and figure out whether these things might be issues for you or not. And those are issues that, you know, you need to address if you have them. Of course, eliminating sugar and starch from your diet are going to be the primary ways to starve out Candida yeast, but, you know, there are other steps to removing that too. Serotonin deficiency. Some people are literally, you know, serotonin deficient for any number of reasons. Either they're not getting sufficient sources of protein in their diet. Tryptophan, which is utilized in tandem with B6 to make serotonin, oftentimes, tryptophan is the least abundant amino acid in our food supply. It's not present in grains almost at all. And if you eat a grain-based diet, you're going to probably be tryptophan deficient. But sometimes people, too, they don't digest well. They have hydrochloric acid insufficiency. They don't digest protein well, and therefore they don't get, you know, sufficient amino acids to be able to make these neurotransmitters. They may be anemic. They may be experiencing menopausal symptoms that interfere with the serotonin. We'll talk about this, but those may be reasons. Seasonal affective disorder. Again, that's sort of a serotonin-related problem also, but common during certain times of the year. Menopause, again, we talked about, also kind of a serotonin-related issue, but also, obviously, other endocrine issues. And food sensitivity issues. Wow, you can really mess with your blood sugar big time, and gluten's a big one for that. And exorphin addictions, grains. Sometimes it's not carbohydrate addictions, but it's an addiction to these morphine-like compounds in grains. Sometimes there are also caseomorphins, obviously, in milk products. But the exorphins in grains are a big one. People will just simply be addicted to those exorphins. And it's not necessarily a carbohydrate thing. It's a morphine thing. So Candida yeast overgrowth is, of course, most commonly caused by antibiotic use and subsequent dysbiosis. That's a major vector for this anyway. There are other things, obviously, too. Stress and the toxic exposures and things will mess with your, you know, your gut wildlife as well, endanger that. It's strongly perpetuated by diets high in carbohydrate foods, and it will generate cravings to feed itself. Candida yeast can also behave like a yeast or a fungus and can go dormant under conditions that are less optimum. So you stop eating the carbs and it says, oh God, nothing for us to eat. It's okay, we'll go and we'll morph into this fungus for a little while. We'll go dormant and we'll encase ourselves and we'll just wait until that birthday and birthday cake come along. and then we'll bloom, bloom forward again.